So, good morning or almost good lunchtime. Hope people grabbed a snack on the way so you weren't starving while you're here. Plus, I'm going to make you do some exercise while we're here. All right. So, hello. My name is Julie Lerman, and I'm going to talk somewhat about DDD, but a lot about sharing what you've learned. And this was specific to DDD, but hopefully some of these ideas you can carry on to other things that you're sharing. And I really like the fact that I'm doing this after David Neal's keynote because a lot of what he talked about also was sharing what you've learned. So this is going to be, though, focused on domain-driven design. Who here is actually doing some kind of work where you're involved with DDD or wishes you could? Like, I learned all this cool stuff about DDD. I hope other people will want to do that with me on my team. So this talk has a pretty funny origin. Some of you may be aware that I also do a lot of work with Microsoft's ORM, Object Relational Mapper, which is called Entity Framework. So it's very data focused, right? This is a data persistence tool. And I also do a lot of work with DDD, and I do a lot about bringing the two together, which to some people may seem pretty antithetical. As a matter of fact, I was at a DDD conference, DDD Europe, a few years ago, and I had done a workshop on looking at where Entity Framework Core was at with respect to being able to map to your database. Like if you design things really nicely from the perspective of domain-driven design, tactical approaches, how is DDD doing with respect to mapping things directly into the database? And so after I did that, there was somebody who was saying to me, well, you really shouldn't be showing people about domain-driven design this way because, you're not showing them the whole end-to-end and they're not going to learn it right and they're going to misuse it and abuse it. And so I wrote this tweet afterwards. And I used this word in my tweet about the DDD purists, and a few people came up to me. They were not happy that I used this word, and I was actually thankful I hadn't used the word zealot, which might have brought yet a more dramatic response to that. Anyway, so I thought about this for a few minutes and went directly to another person who runs a DDD conference in Berlin, Kandinsky or Kandinsky, DDD in the middle, get it? And said, this would be such a great keynote because it's kind of controversial. So I didn't do it as a keynote there, but I did it as a talk, and I did it as a keynote at a DDD conference in London a couple of weeks ago, and I'm happy to be able to continue sharing this message. So, so what is it about this word purists, and what is it that I wanted to talk about? So the title of the talk is, pragmatic or principled. And I really wanted to start thinking about that word. What was it that made me want to say purist, right? What was it that almost made me want to say, but kept it to myself, the word zealot, right? And really, I think when people are, the people who are thinking in those terms, that reaction I got, it's not that they're purists or zealots. It's really that they're really focused on the principles of domain-driven design and want to make sure that when they're expressing DDD to other people, that people understand the principles. So perhaps that is a better word. And with that thinking about the term principle, I wondered, can we still be pragmatic and continue to be principled at the same time? So pragmatic, to me, it's more practical, right? Can we be more practical in the way that we're helping other people learn about domain-driven design? and help other people get excited about it, about using some of these practices in DDD, whether it's from the planning part or building aggregates or things like that. Can we have a pragmatic approach, make sure people understand the principles, but still help other people get on board? Or give ourselves, as David was talking about this morning, give ourselves a bit of a break, right? To say, look, I understand some things about DDD, and that's great, and I can use them and really benefit from them. And then I'll learn more things, right? I'll grow my knowledge of DDD and my expertise and be able to take advantage of and benefit from other things. So I think one of the things that was driving me to that word purist, which has quite a negative connotation, was I felt like, and I actually think about this with a lot of technologies, that that when we focus on the terminology and the rules, right? I mean, yes, principles, but when we really, really focus on rules, I think it shuts a lot of people out. I was at a talk that Eric Evans did a few years ago. DDD's been, the blue book that Eric wrote, 2003. So it's been 16 years. My math skills just flew out the window with my jet lag. It's been 16 years. So he did this talk a few years ago, and he was saying, it's been a lot of years that DDD's been around. How come more people aren't using it? And using it or benefiting from it. And I really thought that, and I think that it's these rules and these definitions. And I think that a lot of people get overwhelmed by the largeness of domain-driven design and all the rules and just don't feel confident even doing any of it. Or even hearing people say, DDD, like if you're not doing this, you can't say you're doing DDD, or, you're not doing DDD, and it really shuts people out. So this is something I've thought about a lot, and what's kind of funny, in the background, this is like a rant I had written. It's just text, you don't have to read it, but it was like, all the things I would be saying about that, because I think about this a lot and enabling people. I was working with a client last month. They had brought me in because this was happening on their teams. People, they were using a domain-driven design approach and trying to get all their Scrum teams on board with it. And people were saying, the developers especially, I am so sick of hearing about DDD. I don't talk to me about it anymore. Just let me do my work, right? And so here was a problem, because the architect and some other people had really worked hard to define things in a way using this great guidance from domain-driven design, and they were having a hard time getting, especially the coding teams, to kind of go along with that. So, so how does this happen? So what I want to do is start with, remember I gave a hint already, we're going to do a little something physical. I want to start with a little bit of an exercise. And it means pairing up. And I learned about this from a woman named Jessie Sternhuis. She is an improv. She does improv, but she uses improv to help development teams work with each other. She uses it in hospitals to help doctors better understand patient experience, and she uses it for all kinds of things. And she did something like this at a conference I was at recently, and gave me permission to share it, but I've put my own twist on it to try to help you step back a little bit and understand perhaps what it might be like to somebody who's never used DDD before, when you're like, when we have to use aggregates, we have to use the ubiquitous language, and we have to use value objects, and all of the terms. So what we're going to do, well, I should say what you're going to do, is find a partner. I would say, maybe somebody who's sitting next to you or behind you or in front of you. And we're going to do something called a mirror game. So Hey, got 700 people in London to do this, so I wonder how it's going to work in Scandinavia. Everybody's so withdrawn, but we're going to do it. So begin by standing up. Everybody stand up. You can do it. I also got them to do it first thing in the morning. And just find, the person closest to you. What you're going to do is a mirror game. And the mirror game is you're going to draw one person. You're going to switch. So each person will do this. So one person is going to draw the numbers 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. And the other person will mirror them. Right? You draw it in air. So, and 4 and 6 and 8 and 10. So do that. And then when you finish doing that, switch and the other person does the drawing and the other person is the mirror. And let's not spend 20 minutes doing this. So just go ahead and do it. Find a partner and draw, or not, and draw 2, 4, 6, 8, and 10. I'm not quite as easy as you thought, is it? Oh, do it. You can do it at the same time, like you're in front of a mirror. Good job, guys. I saw that high five. All right, who's got 5-year-olds? You know what this is, right? This is what my friend who's a teacher does with her class. Like, all the kids start raising their hands, like it's time to quiet down. Uh-oh, the last two guys. Bravo. All right, so what was the hardest one to emulate, to mirror? 8, 4. 4 and 8. I think the problem with 8 is people draw it different ways, right? And you don't know how the other person's style of drawing an 8 is. But a 4 is just all kinds of confusion. What was the easiest number, do you think? The 1 in 10, right? I think that's what I was hoping you'd say, and I think that's what I heard. The 1 in 10. So, imagine if you're learning to do this, wouldn't you want to start with that 1 and this works great. You have all kinds of confidence, and then move on to another one, right? But you get the 1 down, right? And you can actually have that confidence and be successful and maybe even benefit from it because you can use 1s in all kinds of places, right? And then, okay, let's try 2 next, right? And you can start working on the 2, and then you get some benefits out of that. So drawing that back to domain-driven design, my own way of learning things and my way of sharing things with people is just like that. Just like, let's just start with 1 and we'll use that. Don't worry about the rest of it. Don't worry about 8. Don't worry about 4. Don't even worry about that 1 is part of 10, right? Let's just use 1. We'll just use that for a while. We can do some things with it. That's all good. And then we can add another one and then build our expertise and build up our capabilities. And then, you start building this rich set of capabilities with that. So bringing that back to domain-driven design, then the question I ask myself is, so where would you start? What's the number? What's that 1? Right? And sometimes this really depends on if I'm working with a team or if you're just working with just somebody on your team or, however it is that you might be sharing. I think for me, perhaps the most important thing is once you get to the point where you're saying, okay, we're talking about domain-driven design, are the core principles the most important things to learn first, right? Just all those principles, principles, being principled, is that pragmatic, right? So a lot of this is asking, asking questions. This is not necessarily the answer, but a lot of people do try to start with those core principles, and sometimes that's already too much. If you've seen the mind map of domain-driven design, now I look at it and I understand this, but this is overwhelming, right? And sometimes this is the first thing. And telling people, okay, we need to learn all of these things at once. That's enough to make me run away, right? Because I don't even know where to start. So as somebody who has some familiarity with DDD, find you can use your own perspective and experience to figure out, if you're sharing it, where might be a good place to start with the person you're sharing it with, right? You've got some context there that might help. But really, I don't think saying, all right, now we're going to do domain-driven design. I found, not by experience, because again, it's not my instinctive way of going about it, but a lot of people do. They say, okay, we're going to learn domain-driven design. And that is, again, for some people, it's enough to make them like already be blocking, right? And they start not, they're already, they got the plugs in their ears and they're not going to be able to focus because it's too much, right? Or even starting, let's just dive into all this terminology, right? That may not mean aggregate root and value objects. That won't mean something to a lot of people. So saying we're going to learn aggregate roots and we're going to learn value objects, again, could be something that really turns people off. So what works, that I've found, what works for me when I'm sharing is not to tell somebody what we're going to be teaching them, but just to do it, right? Just to jump in and do it. So I do this a lot with clients also, where we'll just start doing the work, but I won't say, maybe we'll start looking for bounded contexts, but I won't tell them that we're looking for bounded contexts. We're just doing some work on their domain. I won't even use the word domain, right? I'll just say, what problems are you trying to solve? Let's just take a look. So I'll steer them towards what a bounded context is, maybe. And then eventually I will tell them, by the way, DDD, right? This is called a bounded context, but I make sure they understand the concept of what it is that they've done, what we're looking at, before we before I introduce that terminology. I added this in because I also found this was interesting perspective. It was that same Kandinsky conference in Berlin. Michael Feathers was speaking a little before me, and he said something that I thought was really interesting that led me to this idea, because he was talking about turning language and structure inside out. He wasn't talking specifically about domain-driven design. But in domain-driven design, one of the paths is you do something called strategic design, and you come up with what's referred to as the ubiquitous language. So you come up with this language of how to talk about the domain you're working in. And then from that language, that's where we start designing our architecture and designing our, I'm going to use the terms, designing our aggregate roots and designing our entities and designing our aggregates, right? So it starts with the language and then goes to the structure. So that's like the classical principled path of going through DDD, right? But I actually find it works a lot when I'm starting with structure. I'm working already with people who have code written. They've already been doing architecture. They've already actually got an application that they're working on, code that they've already written. So we've already got the structure, but they don't have the language yet, which is fine by me because I can actually help them see what the language is from the structure that already exists. Right? So, and this is another reason that I had that early criticism, because that I showed at the beginning where I had talked about the purist, because I was working with existing code, classes that are already defined, aggregates that were already defined, nicely defined domain, right? And then, so we started with that and then worked on DDD ideas after that, instead of starting with all the strategic design and understanding and analyzing the problems you're trying to solve, and then working the other way. So I find a lot of times that if we have the structure already, if we have an understanding of our domain, if we already have code that's written in objects and classes and entities and etc., I can help people understand DDD starting with something that already exists, that they already have a good comprehension of, and we can grow it out of there. Somebody called out something funny I hadn't realized. Somehow there seems to be a history of people in DDD using this analogy of a garden. And I had come up to this on my own, which says, I think, a lot, because maybe it just means it is the perfect analogy. But I feel like, this path of learning, whether it's my own learning or my sharing with other people, really is like gardening in a way. But you can start out with just this, right? Instead of saying, okay, we're going to do a garden now, right? But you can start with this and evolve it and evolve it and evolve it and eventually get to this. Even if you start with the understanding that someday this is what we want to get to, don't worry about that now. Let's just, work on these little things first, and eventually we'll get to the other. But don't stress out about how you're going to get to this big, big, big garden. I had known this story in the back of my head. I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't put my finger on it before I did this as a keynote in London. Would have been perfect, because Bletchley Park, where they did the code breaking in World War II, Alan Turing and all of those people. And then I went to Bletchley Park after that conference, and I was reminded of what this story was. Mic problem. So I thought this was a really good example of where, okay. Is that better? I moved it too far away from my face, but that was a good idea, right? You don't want to hear me coughing. This was such a cool story. So when they were getting these messages, the decrypted messages that the Germans had encrypted with this Enigma machine, that's a picture of an Enigma machine, and they were getting these messages, and they would just sit and just work really hard trying to figure out, every day, because what they were using they were encoding the Enigma machine differently every single day, right? So every day, the people who were trying to decode were starting from scratch. And then one day, somebody went, wait a minute, every single day, it starts with a weather report. Every day, it starts with a weather report, right? So they were able to say, we know that whatever is at this little thing at the beginning, that's going to be the weather report. And they used that as their path in to be able to, understand and identify what that day's encryption was, so that they can go and decrypt the rest of the message. So I like that as a really cool analogy. Again, it would have been so great to use that in London, because it's their history. But I think that's a really cool analogy to, being able to start with something small that you can really manage. And it also aligns so much with one of the most important concepts of domain-driven design, which is breaking big problems down into small solvable problems, right? That's what these bounded contexts are, right? Just take one problem and completely ignore all the rest of it and just focus on this one thing, right? And then you can solve that. That's like the one in if you just focused on the one, it's like, yay, we've got we've got, we've got something we can hold on to. This just made me think of something really funny. My dad, who just turned 85 on Sunday, like literally, I just was thinking, just like this popped in my head. He turned 85 on Sunday. My mom passed away about 4 years ago. Boo. Um, my dad never learned to cook. He was spoiled guy growing up. His mom always cooked. My mom always cooked. He balanced the checkbook. My mom did not know how to balance a checkbook. And my dad, every time any of my siblings and I go home to visit him, we cook and cook and cook and freeze stuff and put it in the freezer and he brings it out. I was there a year ago. I tried to teach him about actually eating vegetables because he does not eat vegetables. We bought a bag of frozen broccoli and put it in the freezer. I'm like, Dad, this is really easy. You can just pour it in to some boiling water and cook it and you'll have broccoli. And it was there for a year. So I was there a couple of weeks ago and tried again. There it was, still the year-old bag of broccoli, but it was frozen, so it was okay. And I encouraged him to try it. The other day, I talked to him. I said, so, any luck with the broccoli? Because, man cannot live on frozen meatloaf alone. And he said, yeah, I actually almost finished it up. Right? I finally did it, and I realized how easy it was. Right? Now I'm like, oh, now he's like got this expertise in cooking frozen broccoli. He can get frozen corn. He can get frozen string beans, right? He got something he nailed down. He's eating, he's getting his nourishment, right? And now he's going to kind of grow his garden. So a lot of this then, that bag of broccoli, right? This is kind of like the bounded context, right? Taking one problem that you can kind of disconnect from all the other problems you're trying to solve in your software and focus on that. Bounded context is the most important concept in domain-driven design. Everything revolves around that. And as a matter of fact, I think it was here, maybe on this very stage, Eric did a talk the last time I was at NDC. He said if I were to write the book over again, I would start by teaching bounded context because it is probably the most core important concept for people to understand in DDD. Not only is it the most important thing, it is the most misunderstood thing. And I am living proof of that. As somebody who came from an ORM, I know of one person in this room who is quite the entity framework guru. He's written a few books on EF Core, and he's doing talk tomorrow on entity framework. Does anybody else here use entity framework? And anybody, you didn't come here hoping I would talk about entity framework, by the way, right? You go to John's talk. So when Entity Framework first came out, what it taught us to do was point to our existing legacy database with its 700 tables and 65,000 foreign key constraints built into it. Point to it and build a model from that. And then everything we did was from that big, huge model. Does anybody remember doing that? Is anybody using EF for all that time? I remember doing that. And I knew it just was not right? It just created so much problems always working on that one big model. And the first time I started learning about DDD, it did kind of bounded context wasn't the first thing I learned about DDD, my introduction into it, but it was quickly thereafter. And I didn't really understand bounded context the way I understand it now. But what I understood was about this idea of taking big things and breaking them down into smaller problems, subsets of the problem, and then just focusing on that. And I used that idea. It wasn't really truly bounded context, but I used that kernel from the full bounded context idea to help me solve that problem that was really, really gnawing at me about those gigantic models, entity data models that we were working with. And so that was how I started kind of down my path of domain-driven design, somebody quickly made sure I understood that that wasn't truly a bounded context, right? Because that's important, because if I'm saying, oh, breaking a data model up into small data models that are easier to, work with just this one here and this one there, make sure that I didn't say, and that is what a DDD bounded context is, because it's really going to mislead people. So I was helped in that way. And that was, not in a critical way, too, which is so great. The DDD community is so wonderful. They were just helping me because they saw I was starting to bring some DDD ideas to a new audience. So they were helping me communicate it. I love this analogy. Actually, it comes from Eric's original book. He used the idea of cells, right? If you think about the bounded context, he used the idea that a cell really knows only about itself. It doesn't know anything about what's going on in other cells, right? And it doesn't leak things out to other cells. We'd all be pretty sick if it did that. And then we have the membranes around each cell. They're responsible for what information passes through from one cell to another. So it's that boundary, right? So each cell is really, really tightly bounded, but the membrane, so you don't think of the membrane as the cell itself. The membrane is really how communication happens from one cell to another. So I really learned about boundaries before I understood the bounded context. And I used that. I realized how powerful it was for me, right? Even though I didn't know the definition of a bounded context, right? And nobody, thank goodness, was whipping me for, saying, well, that's not really a bounded context. You're not doing it right, right? I was already benefiting from this idea by using just a part of it, hugely benefiting from it. And that's really key to my message here, that you can truly benefit from pieces even if you don't have the whole thing already, right? So boundaries was really important. So I think I'm a really good example of this path to learning DDD. I speak at DDD conferences. I write about it a lot. I have a reputation as being, pretty well versed with domain-driven design. I do consulting and coaching for clients with it. But I did have that very different path to learning it than the classical path. I did not sit down and read Eric's book, the Blue Book, from end to end. Although I have to say, I did start reading the book from the beginning, but I got a little distracted because the reason I had picked the book up was not because I'm going to learn DDD, but I was writing my very first tech book. That was an entity framework book. And I'd heard an interview that Jimmy Nilsson did, and they were really interviewing about the big link to SQL and entity framework problem at Microsoft. Does anybody remember that? They both came up with two different teams at Microsoft came up with two different ORMs at the same time because they hadn't been communicating with each other. So they were asking him about that. But at the end, they asked him a question. They asked everybody, what's your favorite book? And he said, oh, domain-driven design. It reads like poetry. And here I was starting my very first book. And I was like, whoa, poetry. I wonder what what is that like in a tech book? And that's why I picked the book up. And immediately when I started reading it, I could have that sense. Eric's very philosophical. But also he was talking about the importance of client collaboration when you're doing, in the idea of domain-driven design. As you're doing this kind of design, the domain experts, your clients, they're key to everything, and how important it is to be working with them and partnering with them, not just like, oh, they don't know anything about programming. Anyway, that's actually what drew me mostly into DDD. Like, that was my first, Hint, because that's something I'd always loved with my own clients. And I thought, here's somebody, now I'm not, he's a brilliant man. I'm not saying I have his genius. But I just thought, here's somebody who thinks a lot in the same way as I do and respects people in the same way as I do. And that was actually how I came into it. I also have felt for many years, especially in the .NET space, that I've been kind of like a canary in the coal mine, right? So it's like, if I can learn this, other people can learn this. But also, I think my path to learning is a good, like this says, an exhibit of how people can move into DDD. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about literally my path into domain-driven design. And I'm wondering if this aligns with anybody else's, those of you who are already kind of interested in it or actually implementing some of the guidance from DDD. And I really think of it as guidance, right? I'm not like these are the rules, right? It's all, to me, it's guidance, and these are great ideas, and there's a lot of heuristics around the guidance that, how things are working and that it's proven, but also, taking into account the fact that we're all bringing our intelligence and our experience and our expertise to the table also. So take that guidance and kind of integrate it with all those other things you're bringing. So I did kind of start with that domain focus, that client collaboration, really understanding what the problems are that the business is trying to solve. And to me, it is problems and solutions, right? We're building software solutions, so we must be solving problems. When I was working with a client, somebody said, and I might be not quoting him exactly right, but he said something like, the domain is the problem you're trying to solve, and the bounded context is the solution, which I thought was really interesting. Anyway, so I was really, really focused on the domain, and then the first thing from there was that I really looked at how I can leverage this concept of boundaries. Again, not the bounded context, but this concept of boundaries. And I was really benefiting from that right out of the box and sharing that with people. Again, because I was coming to this from the perspective of entity framework and ORMs, I was really concerned about how things are mapping to the database. And one of the important things, and if anybody's doing any work in microservices, you're hearing a lot of the things align. As a matter of fact, if you're doing microservices, let me at least say, a lot of the problems and patterns laid out in microservices are problems we've solved with domain-driven design already for many years. So really good ideas and guidance to look at in there. And one of them is, for each bounded context, you should have a separate database. That's something that really freaked me out, because I've always been like, normalized databases, and and I came from a database focused world. I don't mean that I'm a DBA, but I just mean database development. Like, I started with Fox Pro, right? Oh, yeah, no, before Fox Pro. I'm really old. I won't even bother. But, and then something like Access, like forms over data. I was really kind of forms over data, so focus on the database. So I thought about that a lot, and the idea of having separate databases was kind of hard for me to get over. But that was really the next thing I really focused on. Then I started thinking about and understanding better this concept of aggregate roots. And I'm not teaching what all of these ideas are, but so I'm just letting you know. So if it's not something you're familiar with, don't worry about what these are. I'm just saying that, I kind of went into this path. Aggregate root is something you'll see on that mind map. Once I understood aggregate roots, then it helped me better understand what I think is one of the hardest ideas in domain-driven design, And it's not really specifically a DDD concept, but it's critical to DDD, which is value objects, right? Really, really hard concept for me to learn. As a matter of fact, I probably heard and read 5 different descriptions of what value objects were over the course of a year, maybe, before I finally went, oh, right? You know that difference when you're working with something and you're kind of like, yeah, I can do it and it's working in here. I don't really totally get it. And it was that 5th one. And it wasn't because that 5th one was the right one. It was because I was able to now take all 5 of those different descriptions and kind of fill out the picture. And it was the 5 of them together compared to each other that really helped me get there. From there, I started having a better understanding of another thing that is really, really, really important in DDD. So notice I'm doing all this stuff, right, that are things in DDD, and I'm using it, and I'm benefiting from it, and I still don't even get ubiquitous language. As a matter of fact, I got to the point where when I was reading something, if the phrase ubiquitous language was on the page more than once, I wasn't even absorbing the page. I'd be like, right, because I didn't totally get it yet. But I finally understood ubiquitous language. It's really important for me and for anybody who's trying to share what they've learned, whether you're helping your team or just other developers in your community. It's really important to remember how hard it was for you to first understand something. That's one of the reasons I wanted you to do that mirroring game. So it might be, a while since you've had that feeling. Maybe, since yesterday when some new concept came to the table, right? It's been a long time. And I'm not going to make a joke about yesterday's new JavaScript framework. Not going there. Anyway, so I finally got ubiquitous language, and it wasn't until then that I was finally, truly able to understand the most important concept in domain-driven design, which is the bounded context. So I came to it on this circuitous route, right? But then I finally had enough comprehension and experience with these other things that I was finally able to truly understand what a bounded context is and the value of a bounded context, okay? Instead of, I have to understand bounded context first because it's the most important thing in DDD, and I can't move on until I totally understand it. Because it's made up of all these things, not the separate databases. It's part of what's important about bounded context. But it is made up of boundaries. It is made up of aggregates and aggregate roots and value objects. And the ubiquitous language drives us to truly understand what is in your bounded context. So I came to it through the circuitous route. Yes, I said that right. And it was okay, right? I was already learning, using, sharing all these other great ideas. Other people were benefiting from them, and nobody was saying, but how can I use an aggregate if I don't understand bounded context? Well, you can, right? You can have an understanding of a domain entity, right? And an understanding of value objects and really benefit from them, even if you're not yet using bounded context and ubiquitous language. Then I was able to really start understanding the concept of anti-corruption layers. Anti-corruption layers, first of all, I'm glad the whole phrase is there. For some reason, I have a block in my brain. I can never remember them. People now are used to, the way I say anti-corruption layers is like this. Anti-corruption layers. Because I have to go through it in my head. First I go ACLs. Then I have a image in my head of like the Avengers, right? Because they're fighting corruption and crime. And then I can remember the phrase. That's how it is. But it's not the fact that it took me this the circuitous route in order to understand them, but I had to really understand my bounded context before I could understand anti-corruption layers, which is one of the ways where that enables us to communicate between bounded contexts. Because remember, those bounded contexts have those membranes around them, right? Those just, unpermeable boundaries, right? So if we've got to communicate somehow between bounded contexts, how are we going to do that? So messaging, anti-corruption layers, et cetera, are an important thing. So as I was building up this knowledge, but still benefiting along the way, it was also helping me understand more and more that whole mind map, right? Like I started really I've got a lot of this stuff covered. So, I came into DDD in a lot of ways this funny way, because I was looking for something to help me with this instinctive problem I had with entity framework, which was, these huge data models, right? So I came to it, and it's such a weird perspective for a lot of the DDD community, because domain-driven design, the whole idea is to not think about data persistence at all. And here I am coming from, focus on data persistence, and how am I using domain-driven design to help me with that? And it wasn't really helping me persist data, it was really helping me with the architecture, right? But it was helping me understand better how to architect things, because I was architecting them. I was really designing applications from the perspective of making the data persistence better, and having DDD just put that wall, right, between my application design and the data persistence just made me do things even better, right? And it really, I've been programming for over 30 years, okay? And I think, and I was self-taught, right? I came up from this database focus, this database-driven design really focus. I've joked that, maybe I should I would start by designing schemas in databases, right? I'd talk to the client, figure out what they want, and the first thing I would think about is how to design the database. And at that point, now my joke is, at that point I might as well just give them SQL Server Management Studio as the front end and go to town. So, that was my perspective. But along the way, I was also, this was another challenge for the DDD community, in the way that I had come into DDD, but was sharing it with a whole new audience that really hadn't thought about it before, because I was talking about data persistence kind of at the same time as I was talking about domain-driven design. And I was just finding that balance between, I had the expertise in the ORM, and I was just really looking at if we can design, if we're designing our models, our domain models, in a beautiful way based on the things that we learn in domain-driven design, how is Entity Framework able to persist that stuff without us having to also have an extra data model in between? So I was trying to find where that worked, and also provide a little balance, right? And this is where that word purists comes into play, right? Because some people were not a fan of me finding balance, of saying, there's this one beautiful thing I'm doing in my beautiful domain model, and Entity Framework doesn't really understand it, right? And that's when you're supposed to say, well, that's why you always have a data model. You never persist directly to the database. And, as far as I'm concerned, the ORM actually does give us a data model anyway. But there's this point at which I say, sometimes a tiny little thing I can do to my domain model to just make that simple for Entity Framework to do its job without really perverting my domain model, right? I'm not really it's not something extreme that I'm doing. All right, some people say, well, you should never do anything. And I was just looking for that balance and helping people understand it's okay, like this thing here, this doesn't bother me, to put it in, like putting foreign key IDs, right, as properties in my classes, right? People fight that, but it makes it dirty. I'm like, but it makes life so much simpler. And to me, DDD, it's all about stress-free programming, right? So, this whole entity framework perspective was a problem for a lot of people. So I want to talk a little bit about some practical things with respect to what I'm doing when I'm working with clients. So that's hopefully something that you can take advantage of as you're sharing it with people, and also just provide a little bit of advice for helping you if you're trying to help other people learn domain-driven design, or if you're digging into it yourself. Right? This isn't all about, oh, you're already experts and you're already, you want to be evangelists or something like that. A lot of this is stuff that you can use either for yourself as you're learning or sharing with people. So what I do when most often when I'm working with clients, they are clients that have legacy applications that they're working on. They're either getting ready to change them, and they want to really make sure that they're not making the same mistakes. Not that they were mistakes, but using modern ideas, right? Using new ideas to design their software. Or sometimes they've already started doing that project. Like the client that I worked with recently, that they were having the problem with the people who didn't want to hear about DDD anymore. They were 2 years or a year into the project already. So what I do often, again, is I don't come in and say, okay, we're going to do domain-driven design, or okay, we're going to do an aggregate root now, whatever. We just start, depending on where they're at and what problem they're focused on, we just start working on something. Maybe I'll start working on what I know is called an aggregate root, but they don't need to know that. We work on some design. We take a very specific problem in their code or their model that they're thinking about, and we kind of hammer on that. Or maybe we'll start looking for some boundaries in a pre-existing application that they've written, or a data model that they already have, or something. I mean, I've gone in with people with those 700 entity EDMX files, the entity framework data models. Oh my gosh. It's just finding something, or maybe we'll just talk about their business and try to identify a core domain, something. So we do something, we're just doing the work, but we're not defining it. And then I'll stand back and say, oh, by the way, this is referred to as an aggregate, and this class that is, doing all this work and managing all the rules of the aggregate, that's called an aggregate root. So, right, so they start learning the terminology, but instead of starting with the terminology, which I think, because I do this myself, right? I hear the term, and my brain just goes, in shutdown mode, right? Because I don't know what that means. I don't understand it. And while I'm doing that, I'm missing the lesson, missing what it is that I really want to learn. So I go backwards. Then we go do some more work. Then we start talking about domain-driven design. And I might show them the whole mind map just to say, just so you know, boom, this is what DDD is, right? We're not going to worry about it, but just be aware. And I make sure they understand about strategic design and also tactical design. So I give them the big picture, but big picture, overview-y stuff. And then we go back and we focus on something that they can do and they can work on, right? And another client, the client that I worked with recently again, so they were about a year into the project, and so it was a very different kind of engagement. It wasn't this whole idea of the legacy project. I actually spent the first 2 days listening to them argue. right? And the architect apologized deeply for that. But actually, I told him it was really valuable because it helped me understand all the perspectives of the issues that were going on, so I could figure out a nice way to help them with things. And then we did start looking at their code, and we did start, we talked a little bit about value objects, for example. And then we looked at their code and said, all right, what here do you think would make a good value object? And we kind of did some mob programming and hammered on that. And all in all, for me, it's about opening the gate, right? Like, there's all this beautiful stuff here. I'm just trying to open the gate and make it accessible and appealing, right? I make sure people understand. And this actually, when I'm working with the legacy systems, I'm also quite often working with people my age who've been, doing database-driven stuff for a long time, or really focused on, really they're kind of, the way they've been thinking about their domain has been the same for 20 years, and it's really, really hard for them to shift. So for me to say, hey, I have been there and done that, and I have to say, this completely changed the way I approach building software now. It's huge, right? So maybe somebody will call me a zealot, who knows? But for I think a different reason. So this is just a quick look at the path that I do when I'm teaching DDD. So I talk about, for example, the people who focus on database. I try to explain that database persistence is really a cross-cutting concern. It's, unless you're building the next Dropbox, right? This isn't your core domain. Focus on domain, what is the domain? What are the problems you're solving? Try to help people understand that one of the big goals, why do we even do all this, is because DDD really helps take big, messy problems that are like a big bowl of spaghetti and helps us organizing in a way and break things down into small problems that we can really solve. It's so much easier to solve a small problem than a big tangled mess of problems, right? Just find this thing you can identify and focus on. I talk about how important not just how important strategic design is, but make sure people really understand, even if I'm so often focusing on tactical design, making sure people really understand strategic design is, just as important as the tactical. It's there. Make sure they understand that's really key, even if we're not focused on it yet. Anyway, so I just try to walk them through, a lot of high-level stuff and what I think are from my perspective, the things that really helped me find my entry points into DDD that I was really benefiting from in the beginning. Now, there are people who have definitely responded to this approach of teaching DDD and helping people understand it by just doing, a little bit, or let's just focus on, let's aggregate roots. It's a great idea from DDD, and it also is something that we can implement even if we're not using or thinking about the rest of DDD, right? Like, why not? And maybe somebody will call that DDD light. I don't care, right? That doesn't bother me at all. It's still, the whole point is we're taking advantage of these great ideas right away, immediately, and benefiting from them, even if we're not ready to do the whole big picture. So just to make sure, I've done what I think is a really important message also whenever I talk about DDD, is make sure I talk about strategic and tactical so people understand, especially because people look at me and they go, oh, entity framework, data persistence, right? And that's very tactical, like that part of DDD, domain modeling, and the aggregates and the value objects and all that stuff. So strategic is really, really important because that's where we're defining, talking about how important the client collaboration is, right? Figuring out what your core domain is and really getting a laser focus on that. How important the strategic design is to reducing the stress and reducing the complexity of the problems that you've got. and the bounded context, and that ubiquitous language, actually defining that language, the language that describes the particular context that you're working in, the language that you use while you're talking about it with other people, whether it's business owners or developers or people who are building various different perspectives on the team. And even into the code, right? That ubiquitous language for a particular context all the way through. And then tactical, I think that the really important things about the tactical design is it helps me write much better code, right? The value objects, understanding how important one-way navigations are, right? People don't really think about that. We always think of, because there's 2 points in a relationship, you always have to navigate in both ways. And how important a lot of these patterns are to eliminate some of the side effects that you might have. That's a perfect example. Having a navigation that you never use, but you always have to worry about honoring it when you're coding. And then the last thing I just want to leave you with is when I was with this client that had the, don't talk to me about DDD anymore. The CTO actually is a huge company. CTO asked me, so how does one help somebody get started with domain-driven design? And I just off the top of my head gave him some ideas, and I thought I would encapsulate them. So for the strategic part of domain-driven design, event storming is really, really amazing. It's a great way to help, especially higher level business people, understand the beauty of it, because one of the outcomes of event storming, and event storming is like brainstorming with sticky notes, and you bring in all kinds of, you bring in people from all across the business who understand. So, business owners, product owners, coders, the database people, the finance people, et cetera, bringing all of them in. So one of the outcomes of that is getting down to bounded context and understanding domains. And a lot of times what happens is people go, whoa, right, I never really understood our business in this way. This is amazing. So that's been really helpful. And even if you're not doing, true event storming, just brainstorming, right? Like just doing some discovery about your domains and about your business. If you're focused on the tactical end, I think pair or mob programming is really important, especially if there's somebody who has a better understanding of some of the principles from tactical design. And, sit down and do some refactoring, encapsulate methods, because that helps get you towards an understanding of aggregate roots, right? Aggregate roots, are all about control and making sure that your aggregate the root keeps responsibility for what's going on in there. Identify some of these one-to-one relationships that exist in your system and do some brainstorming around, hey, which one of these should be value objects? Probably 95% of them, it turns out. And also, with the two-way navigations, look for some of those and see if you can eliminate one of the navigations that you're not really using anyway, and see what kind of side effects that eliminates. So these are some of the first steps, as opposed to, well, the first thing you should do is, get the blue book or one of the other DDD books and just sit and read it end to end, and now we're going to do all DDD, right? So I think just getting started with some of these smaller tasks is a great way to get somebody excited about the benefits of domain-driven design, just by having success by one of these things, right? By learning how to do the one. Don't worry, the lines will all be gone by the time you get down there. So that's really what I wanted to share with you. And for me, the most important part of it is to be able to invite other people in to benefiting from domain-driven design, instead of getting so focused on the whole big picture, that whole mind map, all of those, all the terminology, all of the rules, right? Because I think that really shuts a lot of people out. And so they're not getting those benefits that I've certainly realized, and I know that when people really come to these aha moments, it's really, really amazing. So I hope that helps you with your DDD journey, and also if you are sharing your DDD journey with other people on your team, at your company, or other developers in your community. So thank you very much. I really appreciate this time to be able to talk about this, and I hope that it was helpful for you. Thanks. Is there anything else? No, that's it.